Alright. The extremely popular topic of the real estates, but with my personal or plagiarized angle to it. Now, I'm not gonna talk about markets, show you graphs or statistics, and make predictions on where the prices are going locally or around the world. I will only share with you my, sort of concern about passive real estate investing and the problems I see based on my combined third and first world experience. I guess the big picture I'm so fond of. So my starting point will be the legal definitions. Since I live in Canada, I'll start with Canadian law. It, of course, is evolved from British common law, and textbooks will tell you that in English common law, which is the source, by the way, of all common law legal systems, all Commonwealth, Australia, United States, everywhere. But in English common law, property may be divided into real property, the land, and land was in early law deemed real because the court could restore it to, I guess, dispossessed plaintiff and not merely compensate him with money for his loss, as could with the so-called personal property, which is not specifically recoverable. So the public popularly considers ownership in the strict common law sense as the legal title on the property, which also includes, of course, the right to sale. Now, but you should never forget that ownership has a wider meaning, which is also legal, even if you consider the meaning of the word under equity. Anyway, I don't plan to educate the public on the subject. I will only stick to the popular information anybody could verify. And because I've done my homework, it only confirms something that I have read long ago. The more plausible theory on the etymology of the word real in the expression real estate. It has Latin roots. It comes from real, regal or royal. And indeed, if you even do some superficial reading, you'll find out that instead of directly owning land, Canadians have land tenure. That means they can only own an interest in an estate. Only less than 10% of the total land is privately owned. The rest is a crown land. And term expropriation in Canada describes the right of the government, which is the crown or one of its agencies, to legally take real property, land, that is in private hands, and apply it for a greater public use or benefit. At all levels, governments require the power to expropriate private land. Unless you have a allodial title to your property, which is practically non-existent nowadays, you don't really own your home, even if you don't have a mortgage, since you have to pay property taxes. Call it mortgage payment, call it taxes, but you owe money, and if you don't pay, you lose your property. Historically, a allodial title was sometimes used to distinguish ownership of a land without feudal duties from ownership by feudal tenure, which restricted alienation and burdened land with the tenurial rights of a landholder's overlord or sovereign. In simple terms, you must be king to have the allodial title, and you can only defend it with your army. So, are you a sovereign? Do you have an army to defend your real estate? If the answer is no, then you don't practically own your real estate. Secondly, mortgages. And that's the well, I guess one of the big cultural shocks I experienced as a newcomer here in Canada. As someone coming from a more or less poor, conservative, backward country, which was part of the Soviet bloc, to me, basic human needs of food and shelter are the main cause of concern and lifetime struggle. Renting was not a thing back in my childhood. The communist government has organized an easy and affordable method for workers to obtain the necessary financing from the central bank. And before the communists, it was a country of small farmers. And I think statistically, in the late 90s, in my country, the homeowners were about 95% of the population. Credit was not a thing either. Nobody would loan you more than a pocket change at all, unless you had a political figure that would underwrite it. And we had in the 90s huge scandal with the so-called financial pyramids, but that's a separate topic. So the things work like this: you save for a down payment, you advance it for your chosen property, and then after, installments would be withdrawn from your wage automatically. This is what I know from my parents, and that's it. And respectively, real estate prices were much lower than today, both in relative and absolute terms. And if you don't see the link here between credit policies and real estate prices, I don't know. Think deeper. It's been, I don't know, half of a lifetime since I moved to Canada. But since then, the credit policies have developed, have exploded. There is indeed economic growth, no denial. And there is a notion of increase in wages, but the real estate prices outpace these by far. But back to my cultural shock on arrival to Canada, after a few months, as a traditional son of my country and culture, I started looking around for a home to buy with my minimal salary. And I was immediately slapped in the face with the telephone number of a price during my first visit of an apartment. Now, before I moved to Canada, right before I moved to Canada, I sold one apartment in my hometown. And the first one I visited here, which was for all intents and purposes similar, was about 20 times more expensive than the one I sold, while my salary was only about 3 times higher. So I concluded that I would never be able to save and buy a home in Canada. Right? Wrong. Banks are willing and ready. Mortgages. Real estate. The only collateral they recognize. Later on, when I started my own business, this was confirmed. They saw the huge turnarounds I was making and immediately showed up to sniff around. But curiously enough, Canadian banks are not into servicing the business. All they understand is real estate. They have no imagination, they have no knowledge, they have no desire to learn or incentive to issue loans to businesses. I mean small businesses, I'm sure. Some big names can just go and take whatever they want at whatever interest they command. But as far as the small business is concerned, the banks are only looking for risk-free business, which by definition doesn't exist. The collateral that you give against your loan must exceed their downside. In effect, of course, it costs them nothing to issue a loan. But later on, part of your working hours, your sweat, your talents would be dedicated to repaying compound interest. Banks don't want you to repay your principal. To give you a hint, bank's balance sheet is a world turned on its head. The loans are assets on banks' balance sheets, and they are allowed to issue huge amounts of loans based on a very small percentage of reserves. This is the partial bank reserve system. Among these reserves are, of course, government bonds. And the government bonds are backed by the government tax receipts. And the government tax receipts are backed by your labor. So you see, it is at least double jeopardy and a catch-22. On the one hand, your labor allows banks to increase their reserves, which in turn will allow them to swell their asset side of the balance sheets by issuing you a loan, which in turn will force you to work even harder to repay the compound interest. Here's on one side your labor, your man hours, expressed in fiat legal tender banknotes, goes into subsidizing the bank reserves, which in turn allows banks to issue loans for you to buy that roof over your head. And dedicated other part of your labor will go into repaying the compound interest. But what's on bank's liability side of the balance sheet, you might ask? Well, these are your savings. So then how would a healthy bank balance sheet look like? Very simple. If you are still pondering over what I just said, let me simplify it for you. It will look like this. Banks holding multiple mortgages, which means they have contractual possessory liens over your properties. And on the other side, you have very minimal savings. So this is what a healthy balance sheet is for the bank. Now that's besides the point that the reserve currency of the world, the US dollar, is created out of thin air and is allocated to the government via the initial primary dealers at an interest. So if you make the thought experiment, and I strongly recommend Mike Maloney's video, which is probably the best video ever made, The Hidden Secret of Money, Part 4. So back to the thought experiment. Say you loan the first dollar into existence, but it's all back to the issuer with an interest of say 1 cent that has not been created yet. Well, it's not 1 cent, of course, because if you look at Federal Reserve Charter, member banks are entitled to 6% annual dividend. So call it 6 cents. But anyhow, this interest cannot be repaid because the 6 cents that are owed on the first dollar that was created have not been printed yet. And in order for them to be printed into existence, a new loan must be created out of thin air, obviously. Meaning that if the government does not go deeper and deeper into debt, the currency with which the interest on the debt is paid has nowhere to come from. Or the government has never enough money in its possession to pay down the debt. So, when a politician talks about balancing the budget, you must realize that this is mathematical impossibility. In fact, anybody can do some basic reading on compound interest, logarithms, Bernoulli formula, and the mathematical constant E, known as the Euler number. I've done the exercise with 2% compound interest with semi-annual compound frequency. And the formula just says that it takes around 40 years for the interest to exceed the principal. That is, of course, in case you don't have advanced anything and the interest keeps on compounding. But what can you advance on a loan if the currency for payment of it doesn't exist and you must loan it into existence to pay the interest on the first loan? So then I've been criticized that I don't offer solutions. But there is no solution. It is a mathematical certainty that system with this design will collapse on itself unless currency supply keeps on expanding. In order for the currency supply to expand, we must go deeper and deeper into debt. Anybody can do some math and study and can figure out that with compound interest, currency supply growth that is required to maintain appearance of normalcy is not growing under a linear function, but it grows exponentially. So when you start with a very small loan, the initial interest will be minimal, but there comes a point where it explodes. And I don't need to repeat to you that the US debt has been doubling at every presidential term. As a disclaimer here, I'm not competent to give any kind of advice, financial or otherwise, and this video is for my entertainment only. But one solution is to play the same game at your small personal level. Go deeper and deeper into debt. On one side, you will be supporting the dying system by taking more and more loans. Leverage up and up, buy more and more rental properties. Wait for a few seconds for their evaluations to increase. Take your next equity loan, pay the down payment for the next, level up, buy the next, and so on and so forth. Thus, real estate really turns into a highly financialized instrument. Values lately have been growing faster than most of the stocks, despite the record high stock market. So, case in point. And I will not even touch the derivative markets, which are much, much larger in currency valuations than anything tangible that exists in this universe. All the bets on futures, which are practically your life and fate, and so on and so forth. That system could maybe work just fine in an infinite world with an infinite fully employed population, which at the same time cannot afford to buy their own property and has to rent yours, Mr. highly leveraged landlord. In a finite world, there is only so many things one could purchase, and the increasing number of bidders competes for limited resources. This is why alternative media talks about the game of musical chairs. And the increase of currency supply, by definition, is... what's the word that I'm looking for here? That's right, inflation. Right? Right. Now, what if all of a sudden we stop going deeper and deeper into debt? Say even if they give you free loans at zero interest, you owe so much that you can't afford to take any more loans. It's the so-called debt saturation. Well, then banks must start paying you. They must start paying you currency to take loans. And I think we are already there, by the way. I heard about Denmark's negative interest mortgages, so probably it already exists. That's besides the fact that current mortgage interests are lower than the rate of inflation. So they may be nominally positive, but are de facto negative. So this totally makes sense. But it also might make sense to commercial banks, because if you think about their balance sheets, if they give you a negative interest loan at a minimal negative interest, their assets side of the sheet will only slightly devalue. But if you have no savings at all, if you are broke and your balance in your checking or saving account is zero, then the bank's balance sheet has liability side wiped out clean. Otherwise, if you don't take more loans, you can't even cover the interest on your previous ones. Respectively, one serious default of a big entity would cause a domino effect, an avalanche, and the system would simply collapse into a deflationary spiral, because there will be no more debt taking, no more currency issued to cover the interest on the previous loans, and so on and so forth. Well, there is a solution to a localized exponential rise in currency supply, and that is a carry trade of a sort. What is a carry trade? Well, here it is as an example. The third world is uneducated enough, and it values first world currencies. And the crazy valuations of the first world, expressed in, of course, first world currency, allow you to use your newly discovered equity riches to acquire assets in the third world. They will gladly take your dollars there because they don't know that these dollars are backed by nothing. So you could eventually never repay your first world bank loan, and the bank will simply repossess your property, and you move into your third world country of choice debt-free with tangible assets paid in cash. Of course, I am not smarter than anybody else, and I am not the first person to figure this out. Others have figured that out long before me and have quickly moved on the entire world by giving all kinds of financial aid, loan, free money, relief from natural disaster, and are quietly acquiring all land and natural resources. Okay, that video is getting too long, but for now, please remember, all above game of musical chairs hinges upon the faith people have in government promises to honor their debt obligations. And this is where I'll start my next video.